In 1939, right as the world was, standing on the absolute brink of tearing itself apart, the legendary science fiction author H.G. Wells looked at the impending slaughter and he made this really shocking
Yeah, a
diagnosis.
deeply unsettling one.
Right, because he said the real problem wasn't politics, and it wasn't economics, it was biology. He argued that we had somehow acquired the physical power of gods, but we were still operating with the brains of primitive reptiles.
Literally primitive reptiles, yeah.
Yeah. So today, we are opening what he called the Mirror of 1939. He referred to that era as the Frightened 30s. And the terrifying thing is, as you look into that mirror with us today, you are going to see our current decade staring right back at you.
It is a really chilling reflection. We're doing a deep dive into a book he published that year called The Fate of Homo Sapiens.
Oh.
And what makes this text so uniquely jarring is that Wells isn't he isn't approaching the crisis as a historian documenting a sequence of events.
No, not at all.
He is approaching it through the lens of human ecology. He is analyzing us as a biological species that is suddenly and quite catastrophically interacting with an environment that it has entirely transformed.
Right.
So the overarching question he poses, which frankly feels even more urgent right now for you and me than it did in the Frightened 30s, is this. Are we actually steering the ship of our civilization, or are we just sitting in the bar of the Titanic, swirling our drinks, and saying to ourselves, well, the ship hasn't gone down yet?
Man, that Titanic image, it really hits hard because it perfectly captures that vibe, right?
Yeah.
The engines are running at full capacity, the iceberg is clearly visible in the water, and the passengers are violently arguing about the dinner menu.
Exactly.
We are caught in this desperate, terrifying race between education and catastrophe. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, to really grasp the mechanics of that race, we have to start where Wells starts, with the nature of the passengers on that ship. If the human situation is an ecological crisis, we need to define the human species ecologically. Like, how do we actually survive? And Wells draws this really sharp contrast between humans and earlier forms of life, specifically looking back to the evolution of mammals in the tertiary period.
Right, and just for anyone whose geology is a little rusty, the tertiary period is that era right after the dinosaurs vanished,
Yeah.
when mammals started to really rise up and dominate the landscape.
Exactly. Before that, you basically had reptiles and fish. Now think about how a reptile survives.
Okay.
A reptile comes into the world with a practically complete, almost unalterable set of instinctive responses, just hardwired into its biology.
Right, like it just knows what to do.
Yeah, it survives or fails based on that inherited physical outfit. You don't have to, send a lizard to school to teach it how to be a lizard.
No, definitely not.
But as we move up the evolutionary scale into those tertiary mammals and ultimately to Homo sapiens, we see the rise of what Wells calls the cerebral animal.
So our survival strategy fundamentally shifted from pure instinct to brain power. The hardware was no longer enough.
Right. The hardware became secondary. The cerebral cortex was this profound novelty in the history of life. It acts as an organ for the storage and application of memories.
Okay.
It allows the individual to actually learn from experience rather than just reacting blindly. A young mammal, and obviously specifically a human child, comes into life far less conclusively equipped than a reptile.
Yeah, human babies are pretty useless on their own.
Completely. It is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, highly vulnerable, but prepared to learn. And because it has to learn in order to survive, it requires a protective relationship with a parent, a family, or a community. It literally has to be taught.
I was actually reading this section, and it struck me how he describes an ordinary ape as just a natural ape, but a human being is a natural animal plus something massive.
Yes, the mental superstructure. This is the foundational concept of his entire argument. A human being is a biological organism entirely dependent on a massive secondary cerebral accumulation of directive ideas.
Directive ideas. So like what?
We are talking about prejudices, traditions, laws, concepts of what we ought and ought not to do, language, and social cooperation. This taught stuff, this artificial mental superstructure, is our actual survival mechanism.
That reframes everything, actually, because all of our laws, our religions, our school systems, these aren't just neat cultural artifacts we invented for fun. From an ecological standpoint, they are biological adaptations. They are exactly as crucial to our survival as, I don't know, a bird's wing or a tiger's claws.
Precisely. We are no longer primarily creatures of instinct. That phase of evolution lies a million years behind us. If you stripped away that artificial mental superstructure and dumped a human being into the wild with only their raw instincts, they would fail utterly in the modern world.
Yeah, they wouldn't last a week.
Right. So the social educated superstructure is how we adapt. And for tens of thousands of years, this worked incredibly well. We developed agriculture, we formed cities, we created complex language and trade networks. We became a massive biological success, spreading across the entire globe.
But this is where the Titanic hits the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
Because for most of history, that environment changed very slowly. Our mental superstructure could actually keep up. But then we hit the modern era, and we entered this phase of accelerating change that is just completely unprecedented in the geological record. Wells calls it the rising gale.
The rising gale, yes. Through invention and science, humanity amplified its physical reach and its destructive power 1,000-fold in what is essentially a mere flash of time.
Yeah.
In 1939, Wells was looking at technologies that had just completely abolished distance. Suddenly, through radio, you could speak to someone on the other side of the planet instantaneously, you could fly across oceans, and terrifyingly, you could drop high explosives on cities thousands of miles away.
It sounds like we've updated our hardware to supercomputers, but we're still running an operating system from the Middle Ages. We have the physical power of gods, but we are trying to manage it with the social and mental frameworks of primitive tribes.
That's a great way to put it.
But if our survival as a species depends entirely on our mental superstructure adapting to our environment, why aren't we adapting? Like, if the old operating system is failing so spectacularly, why isn't it updating?
Well, that is the exact question that moves us from biology into sociology. Because if biological adaptation is too slow, which it is, I mean, we can't wait 100,000 years to evolve bomb-proof skin.
You're right.
So we have to rely on rapid mental readjustment. So we have to look at who is writing the code for that operating system. We have to look at the institutions that actually control human knowledge.
Because if our mental superstructure is the primary site of our adaptation, then the quality of the information building that superstructure is literally a matter of life and death.
Exactly. And this brings us to what Wells calls the greatest crime in the world. He states that the restriction and distortion of knowledge is a crime second only to murder.
Wow. He uses this incredibly stark, brutal term, too. He calls people mental cripples. What is the actual mechanism there? Like, how does a person become a mental cripple?
He means that when a child's mind is starved or deliberately distorted by the institutions responsible for educating them, it produces a person who is incapable of perceiving reality accurately.
Okay.
Wells argues that we recoil in horror from the idea of physical mutilation. Like, if someone were to physically maim a child, society would be outraged.
Obvious.
But our world swarms with these mental cripples. These are people whose minds have been systematically enclosed, built upon falsehoods, and yet they follow the strict laws of their own distorted logic without ever suspecting that their minds have been compromised from the very beginning.
That is terrifying.
They're adapting to a fictitious environment, a simulated reality created by their institutions, rather than the real, rapidly changing world.
And these are the people who are voting, making decisions and fighting wars. They're responding to threats that don't exist and completely ignoring the ones that do. So how is this mass production of mental cripples actually achieved? Like, if I'm an institution in power, how do I write this faulty code? Wells points to three major mechanisms, starting with something he calls the dead tradition.
Right, the dead tradition.
Mm-hmm.
This refers to systems of education and religion that rely on transmitting stale, old histories and ancient myths that fail entirely to explain the realities of modern change.
Okay.
Wells uses his own youth in the 1880s as a case study here. He talks about how his teachers, who were overworked and underpaid, completely ignored the monumental 19th century discoveries in geology, biology, and physics.
Right. They were still teaching this very localized, shallow version of history. It was all about kings and queens and, national triumphs.
Precisely. They taught a comfortable narrative that kept people entirely ignorant of the vast, irreversible processes of change happening globally. The dead tradition keeps people docile. It pretends the world isn't fundamentally shifting beneath their feet. It builds a mental superstructure that is essentially obsolete the moment the child leaves the classroom.
It's the comfort of the familiar, even if the familiar is a lie. But the dead tradition is passive. The second mechanism he identifies is much more active and aggressive. He calls it the propaganda screen.
Yes.
In 1939, he was looking at radio and film, these miraculous inventions that were supposed to spread enlightenment and connect humanity. But instead of connecting us, they were immediately co-opted. He says they were turned into artillery against progress.
What's fascinating here is how directly his observations on the propaganda screen map onto the algorithmic misinformation you experience today.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
In the 1930s, the propaganda screen was a centralized broadcast. A government or a wealthy private interest owned the radio tower or the printing press, and they blasted a unified, restrictive narrative downward to enclose the public mind.
It was basically a giant megaphone.
Exactly. But today, the propaganda screen is decentralized, yet algorithmically optimized to enforce that exact same mental enclosure. Social media platforms, which were heralded in the early 2000s as the ultimate democratizers of information, have become the most sophisticated tools for the restriction and distortion of knowledge in human history.
It's so true.
They feed the user a highly personalized diet of confirmation bias. Anyone listening to this right now who has watched their feed slowly funnel them into angrier, more polarized, and more hyper-specific political content has experienced exactly what Wells was warning about. It erodes the foundation of shared facts that a society absolutely needs to function. The delivery mechanism has evolved from a radio tower to a smartphone, but the resulting mental crippling is identical.
We are building bespoke, individualized propaganda screens now. You don't even need the state to do it. The algorithm does it for profit. And that leads to the third tool of institutional control, which is the official secret.
Right.
This is the strangulation of free scientific exchange under the guise of state security. Why was this happening in the 30s?
Well, Wells observed that as governments began preparing for war, they started placing increasing areas of scientific inquiry under the restriction of official secrets. It wasn't just weapon designs or troop movements. It extended into mathematical physics, psychology, sociology, and even economics.
Really?
Yes. The free, unhampered exchange of scientific thought across borders, which is the very engine of human progress and the only way to establish objective reality, was being completely choked off.
But why go that far? Like, if I'm a nation state, why classify sociology? That seems excessive.
Because the institutions of power realized that objective truth was a fundamental threat to their specific tribal narratives. If scientists are freely exchanging data that proves a nation's economic policies are failing, or that its racial theories are biologically absurd, that undermines the state's control.
Oh, I see.
So they classify the truth to protect the myth.
Yeah.
They call it protecting military morale.
Okay, so let's look at the terrifying picture we have so far. We have institutions using the dead tradition, the propaganda screen, and the official secret to restrict knowledge. They are actively manufacturing populations of mental cripples whose operating systems are fundamentally disconnected from reality.
Yes.
But a misinformed populace is one thing. What happens when you take those compromised minds and inject them with a massive excess of physical, biological energy? Because Wells isn't just talking about passive, ignorant couch potatoes. He's looking at a very specific, explosive demographic reality.
This is one of his most profound insights, actually. And it is a social fact that historians and political scientists often completely ignore in favor of ideological debates. Wells calls it the young man surplus.
The young man surplus. Walk me through the biology of this.
Okay, think about the biological success of humanity. We mastered agriculture, we secured our food supplies, we built shelters, and we protected ourselves from the elements and predators. What is the biological byproduct of that success?
More people.
Yes, but specifically energy, excess calories. In any expanding population that isn't constantly starving, you generate a massive cohort of youth who are, as Wells puts it, full of beans and looking for trouble.
Ah, that's a great phrase. Full of beans and looking for trouble.
It perfectly captures the physical drive. These young men possess the essence of life itself, which is the need to be doing things, to be conquering, to be participating in the world, to establish themselves.
But wait, if humans have been biologically identical for tens of thousands of years, this surplus of energetic young men must have always existed. How did historical societies handle it without, blowing themselves up?
Historically, this surplus energy was bled off. As human communities grew, they needed less physical energy per head just to ensure basic survival. So what does the elite structures do with the excess young men? They sent them out to expand the territory. They utilized colonization, perilous exploration across oceans, and, most frequently, primitive war.
Hang on, let me pause you there. When you say primitive war was used to bleed off this energy, that sounds incredibly clinical.
It is extremely clinical. Wells viewed primitive war essentially as a biological excretion of inconvenient energy. It was a societal pressure valve. If you had too many young men disrupting the internal hierarchy, you sent them off to conquer the neighboring tribe.
Wow.
A certain amount of that surplus was killed off, new territories were expanded into, plunder was brought back, and the social equilibrium of the home tribe was basically restored.
Right. So if you're a king in the Middle Ages, war is basically a management tool for bored teenagers with swords.
Pretty much.
But here is the modern trap. In the modern era, there are no new lands to conquer. The map is drawn, the frontiers are closed. Furthermore, we have this massive increase in productive efficiency through industrialization and mechanization.
Right.
This means dwindling employment. There are fewer and fewer opportunities for these young men to find a secure, properly rewarded, and interesting life. The societal pressure valve has been welded shut, so this biological tension builds up. What happens to that energy?
This is where we see the rise of what Wells describes as the automaton production line. The control structures of the 1930s, which he categorizes broadly as either crowned oligarchies or totalitarian religions, look at this massive, frustrated demographic, and they panic.
Sure.
They cannot allow this surplus youth energy to turn inward and ignite a domestic revolution. It must be diverted. And so they divert it into modern mechanized war.
But modern war isn't primitive war?
Exactly, because modern war utilizes those godlike technologies we discussed earlier, high explosives, aviation, poison gas. It ceases to be a simple biological pressure valve. It becomes a galloping consumption that threatens to destroy the entire species. It's a social killing off on an industrial scale.
And to make millions of young men willing to walk into mechanized slaughterhouses, they have to be processed. They have to be socialized in the dark. This is the Automaton factory. Wells explicitly connects this to the events unfolding right in front of him in the 1930s. He says this young man's surplus was systematically converted into Nazis, fascists, and gangsters. The raw, directionless energy of disenfranchised youth was captured by aggressive, militaristic ideologies.
Right.
These systems provided exactly what the young men were craving: a uniform, a clear purpose, a sense of belonging, and an enemy.
The psychological steps of this radicalization are really crucial. You take a young man who feels economically useless and socially invisible, you restrict his knowledge of the broader world using the dead tradition, you feed him a constant diet of grievance and superiority through the propaganda screen.
Okay.
You give him an absolute narrative that explains away his personal failures as the fault of a shadowy enemy. Over time, his mental superstructure is entirely rewritten. He ceases to be a rational individual and becomes an automaton, a mechanical component in a state-run machine of violence.
It is terrifying how recognizable that process is. I mean, look at the modern world right now for a second. We are absolutely still dealing with a massive young man surplus. Globally, we have millions of young men facing economic stagnation, automation wiping out entry-level jobs, and a profound sense of social alienation.
Very true.
How is the 1930s conversion of youth into fascists fundamentally different from disenfranchised youth today being radicalized via algorithms? We see them being funneled into extremist factions online or being absorbed into state-sponsored social credit models that reward them for policing their neighbors. Are we not still running an Automaton factory, socializing our citizens in the dark, giving them a false reality so they will expend their energy fighting the enemies of the algorithm?
The underlying mechanism of socialization is hauntingly identical. Whether you're looking at a massive fascist rally in Nuremberg in 1939 or a radicalizing gamified feedback loop on a video platform today, the goal of this system is the exact same.
Capture the energy.
Yes, to capture that surplus human energy, strip it of critical, independent thought through the restriction of knowledge, and channel it into a predictable, mechanical response that serves the elite structure.
But to direct this dangerous surplus of young men, to make the Automaton factory run smoothly, these institutions need an essential ingredient. You can't have a war without an enemy. They need an ideology of us versus them. They need tribalism.
Right.
And this leads us directly into Wells's scathing, really controversial critique of the world's major belief systems. Now, before we go further, we need to state this clearly. Wells takes aim at basically every major global system here, both left-wing and right-wing, secular and religious.
Yes, he spares no one.
And to be absolutely clear to everyone listening, we are acting strictly as messengers today. We are not taking sides, we are not endorsing his critiques, and we are not weighing in on modern political or religious debates. But to understand his central ecological argument that our survival depends on global unity, we have to impartially report exactly what he wrote in 1939 and how he analyzed these institutions.
That context is essential. because Wells views tribalism and extreme nationalism not as an innate, unchangeable human trait, but as a virus. He argues that in order to justify the social killing off of modern war, institutions must intentionally foster a chosen people myth.
A chosen people myth, meaning the idea that our group is divinely or biologically destined to rule and everyone else is inferior.
Exactly. This myth acts as an absolute psychological barrier to world citizenship. It is, in his words, a conspiracy against the rest of the world, designed to keep humanity divided into competing factions. And Wells points his diagnostic lens at numerous global systems to see exactly how they cultivate this virus.
Let's start with his critique of Orthodox Judaism. How does he apply the chosen people framework there?
Well, he directs a very harsh critique at the Orthodox remnant of Judaism. He views their specific religious concept of literally being a chosen people as a self-isolating and aggressively exclusionary conspiracy against mankind. In his view, strict adherence to a theology that deliberately segregates the believer from the broader human community through rigid dietary laws, intermarriage taboos, and a belief in divine exceptionalism inherently fosters mutual suspicion and division.
Right.
He argues that historically, this self-imposed isolation and insistence on a divine elite status triggers severe, though he absolutely notes unjustifiable societal backlashes. For Wells, any theology that insists on exclusive divine favoritism is a structural barrier to the universal human brotherhood required for our ecological survival.
He then turns his sights on Catholicism and Christendom, and he uses this incredibly strange but vivid metaphor. He calls the church a caddisworm. What on earth does that mean?
It's a brilliant biological metaphor, actually.
Here.
A caddisworm is an insect larva that survives by dragging around a heavy protective tube that it builds out of random sand, shells, twigs, and just debris it finds at the bottom of a river.
Okay, I can picture that.
Wells uses this to describe the Catholic Church. He argues that the Church is dragging around a massive, heavy shell of unscientific accumulated traditions, ancient philosophies, and contradictory dogmas. He specifically critiques things like the mystery of the Trinity as intellectual deadweight.
So instead of adapting swiftly to the rising gale, it just keeps adding more debris to its protective shell.
Exactly. He argues it is a system that demands believers suspend their basic intelligence to accept these dogmas. But more politically, he views the church as an organization that rules through fear and political manipulation, constantly seeking to preserve its own institutional survival and power over education, even at the expense of human progress.
Wow.
He points directly to the church's support for the Franco regime during the Spanish Civil War as evidence of its willingness to back violent, anti-democratic reactionary forces if it serves their institutional interests. To Wells, it was a massive, powerful engine of the dead tradition.
And then there are the totalitarian religions, specifically Nazism and Japanese Shintoism, which were, of course, driving the immediate crisis of 1939. How does he dissect them?
Wells views Nazism not just as a political party, but as a newly synthesized militant religion. He observed that it was actively replacing traditional Christianity with the worship of blood, soil, Wotan, and the state. He diagnoses Hitler essentially as suffering from manic paranoia, a madness that perfectly, tragically slotted into the psychological needs of a humiliated German population and their massive young man surplus.
It was the perfect storm. The madness of the leader matched the desperation of the surplus youth. What about Shintoism?
Similarly, he dissects Japanese Shintoism as a state-engineered tribal religion. He explains how the myth of the emperor's divine descent was enforced not through persuasion, but through strict censorship of science and brutal violence against any intellectual dissent. Both of these systems, Nazism and Shintoism, weaponized their surplus youth by instilling an absolute fanatical belief in their own racial and national supremacy. They were the ultimate expressions of the Automaton factory.
But if he thought the fascist states were actively engineering this tribalism, what did he make of his own country? He doesn't let the democracies off the hook, does he? I remember he has a particularly vicious teardown of the British Empire.
He does indeed. He entirely rejects the comforting illusion that Britain was a functioning democracy. He eviscerates the British system, labeling it an uneducated, culturally deteriorating crowned oligarchy.
Crowned oligarchy.
Yeah. He argues that the British ruling class was obsessed only with preserving its own wealth, its colonial privileges, and its archaic traditions. He really mocks their obsession with fox hunting and classical Latin education.
But if the British Empire was functioning as a democracy, why was it failing so badly to educate its populace to deal with the modern world?
Because the elite were willfully, completely ignorant of modern scientific realities. They were a complacent aristocracy, terrified of genuine social change, managing a rapidly disintegrating empire without any coherent scientific vision for the future of humanity. They weren't actively militaristic like the Nazis, but their massive incompetence and reliance on the dead tradition made them equally responsible for the catastrophic state of the world.
Finally, he looks across the geopolitical board at communism, specifically the ideology of Marx and the reality of Stalin's Soviet Union.
Right. Wells despises Karl Marx's foundational theories. He characterizes them as lazy, dogmatic, and unscientific. He views Marx's concept of the unified proletariat as a phantom invention, a dangerous oversimplification that completely ignores the biological and psychological complexities of human ecology.
And when he looks at the reality of Stalin's Russia, he sees a tragic, monumental failure.
Yes.
He describes the Soviet Union as a giant with the brain of a newt, right?
Yes. The brain of a newt. It was a massive state with enormous physical resources and geographic power, but it was run by dogmatic ignorance and rigid, paranoid party control. It completely lacked a true, flexible organization of knowledge. It had simply replaced the autocracy of the Tsar with a new, equally restrictive totalitarianism. It was a massive body with a tiny, primitive brain.
So he sweeps the board. Every major system, Judaism, Catholicism, fascism, Japanese imperialism, British imperialism, Soviet communism, they are all infected by this chosen people virus. They all rely on an us versus them mentality to survive.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the relevance of his critique is staggering. Wells was diagnosing the ideological architectures of 1939, but the underlying virus, the psychological need for an exclusive chosen people myth, has not only survived, it has mutated and thrived.
Think about modern digital tribalism. The internet has completely fractured into hyper-specific echo chambers where users are algorithmically rewarded for extreme in-group loyalty and vicious out-group hostility.
We may not use the grand religious terminology of being a chosen people, but the psychological mechanism is identical.
Exactly. Every digital faction, whether it's based on political extremes, cultural grievances, or even fringe conspiracy theories, operates on the absolute belief that it possesses the exclusive truth, and that all outsiders are not just factually wrong, but represent a moral and existential threat.
Yeah.
The tribal virus is thriving in the digital age because it perfectly exploits the old reptilian hardware in our brains.
But that only explains the people inside the tribe, the ones who get the psychological comfort of belonging. What happens to the people who refuse to join one? What is the human cost for the outgroup?
Right. What happens to the people caught in the gears of this Automaton factory who don't fit the mold? This brings us to a concept Wells calls the Murano effect.
The Murano effect is a crucial, deeply sympathetic concept in his work. Historically, Muranos were Jews in the Iberian Peninsula during the Inquisition who were violently forced to convert to Christianity, but were continuously, relentlessly suspected by the authorities of secretly practicing their original faith. They were trapped.
So how does Wells apply that to 1939?
He uses this historical precedent to discuss the marked people, the refugees, the exiles, the minorities, the intellectuals. These are individuals who attempt to assimilate, to break free from the rigid confines of their inherited tribal identity and participate as mere humans in a broader society.
Okay.
But they are continuously forced back into a tribal identity by a suspicious, hostile world. The world refuses to let them be individuals. It violently brands them with a collective label.
In modern terms, you might think of this as the canceled or the perpetually marginalized. It is this horrifying realization that no matter how much you try to participate in the broader society, the tribal system will always keep a label ready to slap on your forehead the moment things get difficult.
Yeah.
And things do get difficult. Wells has a very grim observation about what happens to these marked people when social order and economic stability fail.
When the adaptive culture fails, when the gale rises, economic pressure mounts, and the average person loses confidence that they will be protected or rewarded fairly by the system, social dissolution sets in.
Things fall apart.
A generalized, creeping fear and dishonesty invade the public mind. People revert to those primordial animal reactions we talked about earlier. They stop trusting the system, they stop trusting their neighbors, and they start looking for conspiracies. They look for someone to blame for the fact that the world is no longer comfortable.
They look for scapegoats.
Exactly. The scapegoat mechanism is activated. When people no longer feel protected by the law, the brute in man emerges. Right. Wells vividly, tragically describes how this primordial terror leads directly to the victimization of minorities.
Yeah.
He specifically notes the immense suffering of the Jews in Germany in 1939. But he emphasizes a chilling, universal reality. They were the first victims, but they would not be the only victims.
Because they were just the most conspicuous target for a society undergoing rapid dissolution.
Precisely. The mechanism of scapegoating, once it is activated and legitimized by the state, is an insatiable hunger. It will eventually turn inward and consume anyone who deviates from the rigid tribal narrative.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean absolutely terrifying. Wells is warning us that anyone can become the scapegoat. Once the societal software crashes, once the mental superstructure breaks down under the weight of fear and algorithmic tribalism, the underlying predatory animal takes over.
Yeah.
We like to think we are fundamentally civilized, but civilization is just a thin, fragile layer of taught behavior. When the gale rises, that layer blows away, and we are left with the brute.
It is a devastating critique of human fragility. He is essentially saying that the Holocaust and the other mass atrocities of the 20th century were not bizarre, inexplicable anomalies. They were the predictable mathematical ecological result of a species failing to adapt its mental superstructure to its new high-energy environment.
Right.
If you combine godlike technology with primitive tribal fear, atrocity is the guaranteed outcome.
So Wells has painted this terrifying, stark picture. We are looking at a world collapsing under the weight of mental cripples, a massive unmanaged surplus of violent youth, and tribal viruses tearing society apart while we look for scapegoats. Is there any hope? We have to move from the diagnosis of the disease to Wells' prescribed cure. He doesn't just leave us in the dark, waiting for the ship to sink, does he?
He does not.
Yeah.
He introduces his ultimate solution, a concept he spent years developing, which he calls the world brain. His logic is straightforward but monumental. Because biological adaptation is far too slow to save us from our own destructive inventions, we need an immediate, massive reorganization of the human mind. We need to upgrade the operating system for the entire species simultaneously.
What exactly is the world brain? When you hear the term, it sounds like some sci-fi supercomputer or an AI overlord.
In 1939, long before the digital age, he conceptualized it as a permanent worldwide encyclopedia. But it is much more than a book on a shelf. It is a decentralized, living knowledge curation system. It is a dynamic, continually updated, universally accessible network of all verified human knowledge.
Okay, wow.
The primary purpose of the world brain is to provide a protective structure of adequately summarized, objectively verified knowledge. It is designed specifically to replace the propaganda screen and the dead tradition.
So the idea is, if everyone on Earth has access to the exact same baseline of verified reality, the tribal viruses cannot take root. You can't convince people that their neighbors are demons if the world brain clearly explains the sociology and biology of why that's absurd.
Exactly. It cures a mental cripple by providing the necessary intellectual nutrition. But to support this world brain, to make it actually function in the real world and save us from catastrophe, Wells outlines 3 essential pillars. These aren't just idealistic goals, they are logical necessities.
Let's explore those pillars because they fundamentally rewrite how society operates. The first is peace. But he doesn't just mean a temporary ceasefire, right?
No, he means the total structural elimination of the war tradition. And this requires something radical, the dissolution of independent sovereign states. As long as you have nations competing for dominance, you will inherently have official secrets, propaganda, and the hoarding of resources.
Makes sense.
You cannot have a unified world brain in a world divided by militarized national borders. There must be a unified global legal framework. The nation-state, in his view, is an obsolete, dangerous fiction.
The second pillar is collectivism. Now, given his hatred for Stalin's Russia, he clearly doesn't mean Soviet communism.
Correct. Wells recognized that the violent wastage of natural and human resources for private profit was ecologically unsustainable. A global society requires a collective world economy. This is a rational, scientific management of the Earth's resources to ensure that the basic biological needs of every single human being are met. If you remove the economic desperation, you remove the fear that fuels the scapegoat mechanism and the tribal virus. It's about efficiency and survival, not ideological dogma.
And the third pillar, which directly addresses that explosive demographic problem we talked about earlier, is incessant new enterprise.
This is his brilliant solution to the young man's surplus. You cannot just tell energetic, driven youth to sit quietly in a peaceful world. That biological drive will explode. You have to redirect it.
Oh.
Incessant new enterprise means launching massive, imaginatively exciting global projects. Think of space exploration, monumental architectural marvels, deep-sea research, or massive environmental restoration projects. You must take that surplus energy and redirect it away from the destruction of mechanized war and into the creative, endlessly challenging process of world-making.
But I have to push back here. Look at the reality of the world he was describing. Listen to what Wells himself said. He just told us America in the 1930s had the brain of a horse and Russia had the brain of a newt. The British elite were oblivious fox hunters.
Yeah.
If the major global powers are functioning with the cognitive capacity of amphibians and farm animals, how do we actually build a world brain without it just becoming another centralized propaganda machine? Who curates the curators? How do you get these tribal entities to agree on universal truth?
That is the ultimate vulnerability of his entire proposal, and he knew it. Wells argued that the world brain must be based on a principle he called socialization in the light. This means enlightened consent, total transparency, and the uncompromising scientific principle of free exchange. It must be the exact opposite of the socialization in the dark practiced by totalitarian regimes.
So the scientific method itself has to be the operating system.
Exactly. The world brain relies on peer review, open debate, and continuous transparent revision. That openness acts as its own immune system against capture by a single ideology. But whether humanity possesses the moral and intellectual vigor to sustain socialization in the light against the incredible gravitational pull of power, profit, and tribalism, well, that is the question that haunts his entire thesis. Can we build the system before the brute in man tears it down?
Which brings us to our final urgent takeaway. Wells' message is not a passive historical observation. It is a demand. It is an urgent plea for you to reject the role of the automaton. Do not let institutions socialize you in the dark.
Yeah.
Actively seek out adequately summarized, objective knowledge. Break out of your digital echo chambers. Question your own certainties and demand the truth no matter how uncomfortable it makes your particular tribe. As Wells warns, the race between education and catastrophe is in its final laps. The Gale is here. We must start the hard, necessary work of building the world brain, of upgrading our collective operating system, or we must prepare for the walkover of disaster.
And I will leave you with a final lingering question to mull over long after this discussion ends.
Mm-hmm.
Wells dreamed of a decentralized, permanent world encyclopedia that would connect all human knowledge, a system designed to save us from tribalism and propaganda. Today, we hold devices in our pockets that are a literal technological manifestation of that exact dream, the internet. We actually built the physical infrastructure of the world brain. So why are we still accelerating toward catastrophe? Is it possible that the very medium of the world brain has been entirely captured by the propaganda screen and the tribal viruses Wells warned us about?
It's a terrifying thought. Are we using the greatest tool of enlightenment ever created to simply build faster, more efficient automaton factories? We built the world brain, but maybe we forgot to install the socialization in the light. And so the engines run hotter, the ship goes faster, and we are still sitting in the bar, arguing over the music, waiting for the ice.